Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us this evening to honor the life of Staten Island, New Yorker James Zappalorti on the eve of his death 32 years ago on January 22nd, 1990. And looking at the current condition of hate crimes against the LGBTQIA plus community. I'd like to thank Riley, Annie, the Staten Island Museum team, and our very esteemed panelists tonight. Today, LGBTQIA plus people nationwide continue to live under the threat of violence, with online attacks skyrocketing in lockstep with proposed policies seeking to roll back LGBTQ rights and culminating in attacks like the recent shooting at Club Q on November 20th, 2020. The Human Rights Campaign reports that nationwide 2022 saw at least 35 transgender people fatally shot or killed by other violent means. I say at least because statistically, transgender hate crimes are typically not reported. I'm very excited to have our panelist, Robert Zappalorti. If you guys want to give a little wave, Robert Zappalorti, Paul Moakley, Terry Hardy, and Beverly Tillery join me virtually to discuss Jimmy's life and impact, as well as where we are now with the current status of LGBTQIA hate crimes. Each panelist will have about 10 minutes, and at the end, we'll open it up to your questions, like Riley said. And in lieu of times, I will not read the panelists' very impressive bios, each one, but instead, we'll post those details in the chat. And at the end of this evening's discussion, we'll have about a 30-minute Q&A. So if you have any questions as we're going through, you can put it in the chat or you can write it down, and Annie will get to them in the order that they arrive to us. So to begin tonight, Jimmy Zappalorti was born in 1945 in Brooklyn, New York. And the family moved to Charleston neighborhood of Staten Island and ran a stained glass business whose clients included 30 churches on the island and many others nationally. At 17 years old, Jimmy joined the Navy, serving as a seaman aboard the USS Henrico, seeing action in Vietnam War. He was placed on disabled status and honorably discharged on April 5th, 1995, after a nervous breakdown from the traumatic incident of being assaulted and witnessing the killing of his intimate male friend and fellow Navy seaman. So we'll start with welcoming. We're very, very fortunate to have Robert Zappalorti with us. And thank you for being here, Robert. Robert, you are Jimmy's older brother, and Robert's also written a book, which we'll also put the link to that in the chat. Stained Glass Windows: The Life and Death of Jimmy Zappalorti. And so, Robert, to begin, can you kind of tell us about Jimmy's childhood and his discharge from the Navy and sort of the sequence of events leading up to his murder?
Sure. Jimmy didn't like school too much. So what he did was he wanted to join the Navy because my older brother, Mike Jr., was in the Navy, and his uncle on my mother's side of the family, Martin Ryan, was also in the Navy during World War II. So Jimmy's goal was to join the Navy. So with my parents' permission, at the age of 17, he dropped out of school and enlisted in the Navy in 1962. After boot camp, he was stationed on the ship that you just mentioned, and the ship would deliver military supplies to Da Nang, Vietnam. He went through a nervous breakdown because his friend was killed in Vietnam, and there was a lot of stress from him being a gay man. He was always at turmoil inside himself, so he had a nervous breakdown, and the Navy gave him an honorable discharge. So when he came home, he was a changed man. He had seen a lot of violence while during the war and with his friend being killed. So he had to readjust to being a civilian, which he did quite well. Trouble is, he was torn between being a gay man and living on conservative Staten Island. Back in 1990, Staten Island was a rather conservative place. So Jimmy sort of lived in two different worlds. During the week, he would work in the family stained glass business as an artisan, and he really enjoyed working with the glass and creating art. My father taught him a lot of different things on how to make the windows. There's a photo up on the screen where he has a red shirt on, and Jimmy's putting the putty to seal the window to keep the window from being exposed to the weather. The putty would seal it up nice and tightly, and before it got set into the church window. But on the weekends, Jimmy would travel into Manhattan. He'd go into Greenwich Village and visit his friends and go to the different gay nightclubs, and he could let his hair down and just be himself. So he really liked that aspect of it. But Jimmy also liked to drink a Budweiser beer and other libations. Mm-hmm. And he never learned how to drive. He was just too nervous. When my father was trying to teach him how to drive a car, he almost had a few accidents, one time with a bus. So my father says, "That's it, you're not going to drive anymore." So Jimmy had to travel by public transportation. He would take the bus or the train down to the Staten Island ferry, go into Manhattan, and then take the subway up to Greenwich Village. So he would go out to nightclubs with his friends, and he would drink a lot. And then he'd had to travel back home by himself at night. And being a little drunk, he was often a victim of muggings. He would sometimes fall asleep on the ferry, and the thieves would take his wallet, or sometimes they would cut his pockets to remove the wallet without him knowing it if he was sleeping. And if he was awake, he would sometimes get in fights with these muggers, and he was beaten up many times. So it was a tough life for him. But on Staten Island, we lived in the southern shore down in a town called Charleston, and there was a nice beach down there, and Jimmy used to like to go down there, and the neighbor had a rowboat, and he would go out in the river, and he liked that spot so much he decided to build a little shack, which he called his beach house. And there's a photo up on the screen. Jimmy has a red shirt. That's me in the middle, and my oldest son, Robert Jr. He would have parties down at his beach house. It took him a long time to build it. He would collect driftwood off the beach, and my father would give him old windows and doors. And after about 2 years, he built a 3-room shack that had a living room, a kitchen, and a bedroom. He also had a nice patio with a barbecue, and he would entertain his friends there. In fact, that's when that photo was taken. It was taken in July of 1989. And that was the last time I was at the beach house with Jimmy. And we would always have a good time. So I guess it was in January of 1990 when 2 men from Staten Island, Michael Taylor and Philip Sarlo, brutally murdered my brother Jimmy, not for money, not for revenge, but out of prejudice and hatred. Jimmy was beaten, stabbed, his throat cut, his body thrown in the Arthur Kill River to hide the crime. But Jimmy's body was found the next morning by my brother Michael. Once the word got out, humanity rallied around the inhumanity. Taylor and Sarlo tried to silence Jimmy for being gay, but they only succeeded in giving him a voice of change. Jimmy was murdered simply because he was a gay man. He was an innocent soul who knew no fear, would only look for the good in people. He never thought that evil would touch him, but he was wrong. Although Jimmy lived a simple life, his murder propelled him to a local martyr. Would Jimmy ever have thought that his life and death would have such an impact on so many other thousands of people? Probably not, because he was too modest, too innocent to believe that his sacrifice would affect so many other lives. Jimmy was a good son to his parents, a lover of art and beauty, a musician, and finally a victim of hate. Through an intense investigation, police detectives Robert Bergen and Larry Jensen learned that Michael Taylor and Philip Sarlo were the #1 suspects. Through smart police work and help from the public, they were both eventually arrested. Taylor was arrested in South Beach on Staten Island a week later after the murder. But Philip Sarlo had fled to Florida, and he was arrested a month later in Ocala, Florida. I actually got to speak to the detective that arrested Philip Sarlo. So through a plea bargain, Taylor and Sarlo pled guilty to second-degree murder. They were sentenced on January 3rd, 1992 in Richmond County Supreme Court by Justice Norman Failig. Jimmy's murder was the first crime in New York City history to be officially identified by the New York City Police Department as a murder inspired by bias because the victim was gay. His murder caused so much attention, it couldn't be ignored by the citizens groups, by Mayor Dinkins, other politicians, and Cardinal O'Connor of the New York City Police Department. There was many positive outcomes from Jimmy's murder. The Staten Island community came together in a positive way. It sparked a firestorm of protest that led New York City to finally pass its first anti-bias hate crimes bill, albeit it took 10 years to get it passed because of all the negotiations by the politicians. It was on July 10th, the year 2000, that Governor George Pataki signed into law the hate crimes bill. Jimmy's name was mentioned during the bill signing ceremony. Other positive outcomes was me writing the book so I could memorialize Jimmy's story and let everybody know about him and what happened. There was a street, you can see the picture up there. Jimmy's name was put on Andrevet Street. And I should mention that Philip Sarlo died in prison several years ago, but Michael Taylor is still in jail after 32 years, but he is eligible for parole, but has not been able to get paroled because I understand that he had pretty bad behavior while being incarcerated. So I'm just happy that I was able to tell Jimmy's story and that he was not forgotten and his murder was not in vain, because so many good things happened and so many good people stepped forward to remember Jimmy, and his sacrifice was not in vain. Any other questions?
Well, thank you so much, Robert, for that wonderful overview of Jimmy. And if I'll let people know again, if you haven't read Robert's book, I highly recommend it. And I guess we'll, in lieu of time, we'll move on. And if you have any questions for Robert, you can put them into the Q&A or save them for later. But we were just very, very fortunate to have Robert with us here tonight, and very happy about that. So I'd like to welcome next Paul Moakley. Good evening, Paul.
Hey, Ed.
And Paul, you're sort of the rare breed of a native New Yorker, born and bred on Staten Island, correct?
Yes. Yeah, I grew up on Staten Island. I was born in Queens, but we moved there when I was 1, and I've lived there pretty much my whole life. And it's a place that inspires me as a documentarian and a filmmaker. And Jimmy's story is definitely one that looms large in my mind.
And
And
you've been working on a documentary short for the last several years?
yes. And I would say for myself, it's something. Jimmy's story started from, I remember when it happened. I was probably around 14 at the time, but so I had some family members, some cousins who are friends with the Zappalorti family, who also remember, when this terrible murder happened. And I just want to say, I'm so thankful to Robert for being such an incredible steward of Jimmy's entire biography and just caring so much for his brother's story. And just really being his biographer and keeping all the pieces together. Without him, we wouldn't have this very rich history that I'm hoping to put some of it into a film. I first, besides discovering the story like when it happened, and it being something that loomed in my mind, being a Staten Islander, I would say, as it was mentioned earlier, it could be a pretty conservative place. I grew up in a very Catholic, conservative, community around mostly like, former Irish and Italian, immigrant families who settled on Staten Island. And it wasn't always the friendliest place towards gay people. And so much of this happening in 1990, was so much before like the culture really began to change in a major way, where gay people were really part of the mainstream media, were being talked about thoughtfully and sensitively within the news media. At this moment, I think that gay people were seen a lot as either being problematic or being mostly victims of AIDS or crime. And that was like the predominant lens and way we were seeing a lot of like queer stories. I really became interested in Jimmy's story. I would say one of the pictures here is a placard from the Staten Island Pride Center. And I would say, I'm trying to remember the exact year, but it was maybe about 6 or 7 years ago, maybe even a little bit longer. I was hired through this New York City agency called Art Connects to curate a permanent exhibition in the Staten Island Pride Center and bring some artwork to the center when it was on Victory Boulevard. And I saw this placard about Jimmy and I became really interested in him. And I just happened to find Robert's book in the library at the center there. And from that moment, I bought a copy of the book and I spent a lot of time with it. And the story just stayed with me. And I think Jimmy's story, I was connecting with it because we came from similar backgrounds in Catholic families, raised in the same place. And I was heading to be kind of the same age in my life. And I was really thinking about like, as a queer person, the way we navigate and self-monitor and all the like things that like affect us in terms of, just having to live with a certain amount of fear, a fear of being harmed for being who we are. And the thing that I love about Jimmy's story is, Jimmy just had this special personality, and I really loved the way like he just, he wanted to live his true self, and that was as an out gay man, and it was something that harmed him. And I think, the culture has just changed so much, and we're in such a different place. I thought it was really important to preserve a story like Jimmy's and talk about the culture at that time that's not so very far away. And then also talk about the incredible things that came out of what his family did and what this group of activists did after he was killed. And I just wanted to preserve that history and put it into a film. So it was kind of a combination of all these things that I connected with and found really inspiring. It's a very long-winded way of talking about it, but
what are some of the challenges you've met in telling the story? And,
Sure.
did you also talk about your approach and why tell it now?
Yeah, well, I think like the most important reason to tell it right now is because sadly, these these attacks have not gone away. They've increased in a lot of ways, where we're living at a time when, you know, just a couple of years ago, we were seeing gay marriage pass. We were seeing great strides for the gay community, you know, that were happening that felt very hopeful. And now there's a bit of a, like, you know, we're seeing a bit of a recession in these things. Things are being pulled back. I think I read recently that there's over 250 bills, you know, in the United States that are anti-LGBTQ bills. We're seeing laws in Florida, like the Don't Say Gay bill, which are strangely similar to the propaganda laws that exist in Russia, things I would never imagine kind of creeping back into our lives after people have fought so long to be out, to be open, and to live, you know, to live their life freely. And so that's definitely one of the main reasons why I think this film is important right now, and Jimmy's story largely is really important right now, because his death did change the law and really added a layer of protection in terms of being harmed. But I would say some of the challenges in telling the story is that it is 32 years old. We are telling a story that's set far in the past, but thankfully, Robert is an incredible storyteller, and so is his sister Peggy. And we've really tried to keep the film, the core of it, with his family, and telling the story through them, along with some of the activists from the Anti-Violence Project, like Matt Foreman, who was the former director, who worked very closely with the Zappalorti family. And we're still in progress. And there are lots of people on Staten Island who were working for, you know, or organizing through Lambda on Staten Island. And there were really important activists in the community. And I also love, like, the story out in Staten Island, set out in Staten Island, because, you know, a lot of people think of, like, you know, queer life in New York City in this very big way, but Staten Island kind of, I think, has a history that a lot of people don't know about. So I'm hoping to bring some of that to the surface. But it is challenging. We're dealing with a lot of archival. We're dealing with a lot of things set in the past, and just trying to make those things feel like they still have an urgency is the real challenge. But thankfully, because of Robert, we have so much archival on VHS, through beautiful photo albums, and all, like, you know, also, in addition to Robert, his neighbors down in Andrew Vett Street were really also, they preserved so much of the news and all, like, the media that came out at that time. So we're incredibly thankful to them. But I've been lucky to be working with a really creative film crew, who's also helping to kind of just make the story have another layer and feel modern and alive in this moment. But yeah, I would say that the challenge is just time passing and making sure these stories don't disappear. It is a real preservation project, I would say, in a lot of ways. You know, in this picture here on the left, I would say is just, you know, this is our interview with Matt Foreman at the Pride Center in Manhattan, where the AVP organized in that building. And we wanted to make sure that we were, like, connecting to the original spaces where people were organizing and where this story has its origin. And then on the right here, we're in Robert's living room making a studio here with my DP Garrett Smith, and going through some of the albums there. These are just some clips from one of the incredible things about this story, and one of the things we're really lucky to have, is this was, you know, not just a local news story. It really made national news for a couple of years. And it's really special. I would say the more I dig into Jimmy's story, it's like this giant onion. There's so many layers to it. You know, at first, at the core is this incredibly violent story that's incredibly tragic. But then there's this story of this family that was incredibly brave. And without the family coming out and not being embarrassed of their loved one, which many families at this time, you know, a lot of this violence wasn't talked about because a lot of families were afraid to press charges, to come out, to speak up on behalf of their family members. But from what I've learned is that the Zappalorti family was just, they loved their brother. They were standing behind him in life and in death. It wasn't something new to them. They, they really took care of their brother. And for years, they continued to go on national television. These were some of the biggest shows in, my childhood, watching Geraldo and Sally Jesse Raphael and all these other talk shows. But they were really important at getting the word out. And at this time, this was still new to a lot of America. People were really afraid to talk about this stuff. People were not out in the same way. So I hope the film, preserves the importance of these actions that family members were taking, that activists were taking, and certain media figures too, in some ways. These are some scenes that, one thing I'm excited about within the film is just this archival. There's a lot of things that I think are really important to preserve. And sadly, some of it is the hatred that did exist on Staten Island at this time. On the left here, you're seeing a protest that is an anti-gay protest in Charleston. And on the right side, you're seeing a march that's happening because a couple of years after Jimmy was killed, sadly, Robert's son, Michael, was attacked in the same neighborhood. And this is an organization that happened in support of him. And people came out to Staten Island from all parts of the boroughs to march with Michael and to have his back. Literally in this photo, you see Michael walking in the center. And behind him, it's amazing. You're seeing Jimmy Zappalorti, but you're also seeing so many other victims from that time period. Like Julio Rivera was another person who was murdered a few months after Robert. And I don't know, one of the things I think, and I hope that is preserved by the film and comes out, is just the importance of all these small steps. It's people coming out very slowly. It didn't just happen overnight, but it took a lot of people to speak up to really change things and to eventually get to change the law. But, I think these things go hand in hand. You don't want to forget the real horrible history here, but you want to also, lift up the people who really did the work to change things. Being a documentarian, I think I'm always trying to lay all these things out, let people experience them and walk away having learned something. And what we've learned is really the work of the families, the activists have really changed things here in these murder stories.
So we're at time, Paul, but a quick question is, what year was the New York State LGBT anti-hate law passed?
It was 10 years after Jimmy's death in 2000.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I guess we'll move on to Terry Hardy. And Terry, I've known you for quite some time, and I know that you often create memorials that address human rights and equality. Can you give us a little insight about your interest in memorials as an art practice and sort of what led you specifically to creating the Jimmy Zappalorti Memorial Mandala?
Sure. Thanks to the Staten Island Museum for this opportunity. I think it's my obligation and responsibility as an artist to use my voice to shed light, educate, and remember individuals who have impacted my life directly and indirectly. And the whole practice is a culmination of years of loss, and observing lives the lives of people who passed away that seem to no longer be relevant or remembered. People who probably thought they never had a voice, or that maybe their voice didn't matter. And when given the opportunities as an artist to produce work, my first goal is to research the areas in which the work will be presented and educate myself on people who really touch me, as far as those who have suffered or died at the hands of civil rights abuses, gay rights abuses. So in Jimmy's case, given the opportunity to submit work for the Yes and show, I had heard about Jimmy and read about his murder in a street magazine in Atlanta, some free magazines that come out every week. And so that stuck with me for a long time. And then I was able to travel to Staten Island, and I like to immerse myself in the environments where the people I memorialize when I can, to walk the streets where they walked, to see where they lived, and just to try to visualize their lives. And that's what happened in the case with Jimmy. And I was so honored to be able to, that the family business, you can still see the signs of the family business, the houses there. I never quite knew where the beach house was. I thought it was down Androvet Street, when in fact, I met Paul at the opening and he said it was across the street behind the neighbor's house. So it's very important for me to continue to shed light on individuals. And with a little luck, it educates the public and their lives continue to live on. On the screen now, to the right, it's actually mislabeled, but to the right is it's called 10,000 Flowers for Willie Grimes. This was produced in downtown Greensboro, North Carolina. And Willie Grimes was a 20-year-old, the first son in his family to attend college. And in 1969, he was gunned down on the streets, just walking to get a snack. And his memory within the civil rights, in particular African-American civil rights, his name is known a little, but I felt it was my duty and obligation to create something that if it inspired and educated only one person about his life and how important it was, then I did my job. So I was very fortunate. This was the first time I used elements from the cemetery that I had collected, which are flowers from cemeteries in Georgia and Alabama. Next slide. And here are other uses. I'm from a small Western town in rural Alabama, and the first Sunday in May every year, we have what is called decoration. It's when all the old flowers come off the cemeteries and all the new flowers go to the cemeteries. And so it's sort of a homecoming of such, especially to the country church that I grew up in, which has 5 generations of my mother's family in the cemetery and 3 generations of my dad's family in the cemetery. But I was noticing when the new flowers went on, it was so beautiful. And I was seeing dumpsters and containers full of the old flowers. And that's when it became apparent to me that I needed to recycle these flowers once given in love, to once again use these flowers in love to commemorate and memorialize others. And they've been used in a number of ways. The Jimmy Zappalorti Memorial Mandala designed around the elements that I felt were connected to him. Having never met him, Robert's book was very instrumental in shedding light on Jimmy's life and the things he enjoyed. And I was very happy to produce that. Some of the elements, I can go into the elements of the mandala. For instance, his time in the Navy, the outer circle represents the USA patriotic colors. The white outside circle represents the compass, the Navy compass. And moving forward in, the colors of the gay flag, his spirituality represented with a cross, and the blue and green inside the cross represents the beautiful park-like setting that is Staten Island. And then the sun is represents the sunsets that he would watch from his beach house. And though sometimes the mandala seems so abstract, every element represents a certain part of a life.
Well, thank you so much, Terry. Appreciate you being here tonight, and we'll move on to Beverly. And Beverly Tillery is the executive director of the New York City Anti-Violence Project. Good evening.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. And my first question to you is, what are you and the Anti-Violence Project seeing right now in terms of the state of hate violence across the country, where we are now, and what's similar to what we've seen in the past and what's different now?
Yeah, I actually want to just first say how honored I am to be in such good company tonight and to be able to hear the stories of Jimmy and how he's been memorialized by so many great folks on the panel. You know, one of the things that I also wanted to share, I was talking to one of my colleagues earlier today about this panel, and she remembered Jimmy's death and the time. And one of the things that she also raised was that the issue of mental health issues was also really prominent in the conversation and the response to Jimmy's death, and that it was an opportunity to sort of raise awareness about mental health issues and how they intersect with violence, because so many in our community are dealing with you know, mental health issues for various reasons, and then often don't get taken seriously when they're dealing with violence or when they need a response to violence. And you know, it reminded me, or it sort of brought me back to today as well, and the current conversation that we're having in our city about how we deal with folks who have mental health needs, and what's the proper response to those folks, and the ways in which so many issues overlap with this issue of violence in our community. I'm going to try to give just a little bit of paint a little bit of a picture. I think, you know, it's already been mentioned, particularly by Paul, about what's happening right now in this moment in our country, and how we really are in what I would call a backlash moment, where, you know, after years of, you know, sort of starting that fight, you know, really, you know, the time when Jimmy was murdered in 1990, AVP was only 10 years old, really a new organization. And it was AVP in New York City was only the second organization in our country that was dedicated to dealing with and addressing and ending violence that is experienced by the LGBTQ community. And so that was a time where the community and the organization was really focused on bringing people's attention to this violence that was happening, right? That moment of, you know, having, unfortunately, to tell these stories of deaths, but also, you know, people who were being attacked in New York City and other parts of the country, who were starting to speak out more and to stand together and come together as a community. And, you know, all of the work that people did then laid the groundwork for not only responses to hate violence, but the community coming out and standing up for all kinds of rights and changes. And so after all of the successes that we won, we are now back in a moment where it feels like the world around us or some in the world around us are saying, hey, wait a minute, how did we let all of this go by without stopping it? And it is a moment, particularly at AVP, we've been seeing this increase in violence, particularly reports of hate violence, and this shift of climate across the country that is allowing and kind of giving more permission for violence in all forms. You know, even, you know, to some extent, we've seen a normalization of the violence, of the hate violence, in that we even started to see probably about 10 years ago that people were reporting violence less. And when you talk to people in our community, it wasn't that violence was happening less. It was that people were feeling like it was just a part of the everyday, of their everyday experiences, and that they weren't assured that much was going to happen or much could happen if they reported. So many people were saying, why report? Why even bother? And especially we've seen this increase, particularly as it was always already mentioned, the violence against trans and gender non-conforming and non-binary folks, but also other people who are marginalized in our communities, people of color, low-income folks, folks with mental health issues, immigrants, sex workers, and others who live in the gig economy in our society, have been increasingly seeing more violence and experiencing more violence. But we've seen a real spike since the 2016 presidential election. And that shift was really significant because what we had was a change in the public discourse where a significant public figure in our former President Trump really embracing the rhetoric, anti-LGBTQ rhetoric, and giving permission to many in the rest of the country to publicly attack our community. And we've seen not only increased incidents of hate violence attacks on individual folks, but we're seeing the rise of violence that's perpetrated by and instigated by white supremacists and hate groups. We've seen all of these attacks on drag queen story hours, but we actually at AVP did a report in 2019 looking at just that Pride season that year, where we saw the beginning of the attacks on drag queen story hour, but also incidents at bars across the country. In Harlem, we had a bar where the Pride flag was burned twice outside the bar. You know, things that maybe, you know, a brick thrown in a bar maybe seem small, but you're seeing these increasing incidents over and over and over, and then becoming increasingly serious and more violent and intense, leading, of course, to what we saw in Colorado Springs. One of the things that we've been seeing, in addition to, of course, violence in our community, is that this climate is impacting other marginalized communities as well, right? We know that we're seeing increased hate violence in communities of color, attacks against Muslims, attacks against the Jewish community and immigrants. And one of the things that we saw happening in response after 2016, when President Trump was elected, was we also saw more people in the community, I think across communities, coming together and really starting to say, what can we do? There must be something that we can do, because we're seeing these incidents happening, playing out in all ways in our communities, right? We're seeing incidents on the trains and the bus. We're seeing incidents in our workplaces, in our schools, in all aspects of our community. So I think, again, like was described at the time of Jimmy's homicide, there is an awakening of the community and community coming together to try to figure out what are the best responses. How do we create safety in our communities, and how do we build across communities as well? One of the things I definitely wanted to talk about, we've already talked about, the increased number of homicides. Some of the other things that we're seeing that are old and new again is we're seeing now across the country, but also happening in New York City, a trend of targeting gay men at bars and through dating apps. And folks may have heard that this past fall, it kind of came to light that there were at least a few gay men who had been targeted at gay bars in and around Hell's Kitchen, where they were being drugged and robbed. And two gay men in our community were found dead after these incidents, Julio Ramirez and John Umberger, both this past year in April and May of 2022. And we've also been seeing communities coming together demanding a response and investigation, and really also demanding that we find ways to keep ourselves safe and make ourselves safe and protect ourselves. One of the things that has been changing over time is how we, some of how we're responding to these incidents. As we are engaging with more and more folks from all walks of life in our community, particularly those who are more marginalized. And, it's always been the case that folks in our community who hold multiple marginalized identities, again, like folks of folks of color and immigrants and trans and gender non-conforming folks, experience more incidents of violence and are more likely to experience violence. And as those people are being more in the forefront of thinking about what are the solutions that are needed in our community, we are having more of a conversation about how do we address this violence without relying on the criminal legal system, which inflicts more violence on our community and in particular targets communities of color and those marginalized folks, where folks who are impacted by violence don't always feel safe going to the police or relying on those systems. Folks are turning again to community and saying, how do we sort of double down, and how do we build accountability for the violence that's happening without, again, relying on this system that's going to continue this cycle of violence, because ultimately we want to try to end that cycle of violence. And of course, we haven't figured out how to do that yet, but those conversations are happening more and more, where people are thinking about different kinds of strategies and ways to keep each other safe, and really bringing communities together, which I think is really exciting. And as always, we're seeing ways that our queer community can lead the way in finding solutions that, because of the unique nature of our community, that we need different kinds of solutions, but the solutions can also be better for everyone in our society. Do we have a link? Oh, yeah. I was going to ask if we have a couple of minutes to talk about some of the strategies for solutions.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you next. So yes, please. We are nearing time, but I think it's so important. So, and how what individuals can do as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, in some ways we are continuing to rely on some tried and true strategies and solutions. And in some ways, again, we've had to come up with some new options for our community. One strategy that AVP has always used is really bringing together our community to support each other. And our hotline, which has run since the day we started in 1980, nonstop, is a way that people can get support from others in the community, and then be linked to direct support, counseling, and legal services, really to make sure that survivors have what they need so they can heal and rebuild their lives as needed. Recently, we revived our bar safety program, where we're sending out teams of volunteers to canvass bars across communities of the city to make sure that community members have basic safety info and tips, that people are understanding the strategies that are being used to target us, and also to support bar staff and owners, I think, in a way that we have not done as much in the past, because this is a new reality for them in the wake of Pulse and Colorado Springs, where the institutions are being attacked in a different way, and there is a particular kind of fear there. So, you know, two things that people can do if they want to get involved. If you're in New York City and you want to get involved in hitting the streets and being a part of community, going out and canvassing folks and telling them how to be safe, and talking to bar owners and bar staff about strategies around safety, you can sign up as a volunteer at AVP's website. And folks all across the country can sign up if they want to join our hotline volunteer team. Our hotline volunteers are amazing advocates and folks who take time out of their weeks to really talk to folks who are in crisis, who've experienced violence, to support them through those crises and to help them get to the other side. We invite folks to participate in a training where you can become a certified rape crisis counselor, and you can take those calls anywhere. We actually have some hotline volunteers in other parts of the world talking to folks, because it's 24 hours. So there's always a time that you can take a shift. And then we're doing some deep cultural work now, really trying to shift that culture change that we've seen to defend and secure our safe spaces. We've done a lot of work with Drag Queen Story Hour recently because of the attacks. I'm helping them safety plan and doing safety trainings with them so that they can defend their events across the country. Folks in Staten Island may have heard in December that there was a great example of that, where Drag Queen Story Hour event in Staten Island was being threatened, and the community came out to defend. And it was another show of Staten Islanders coming out in support of the queer community. So there's lots that people can do around that. And we can connect folks to Drag Queen Story Hour if they want to do that and be engaged in that. And then there are ways that we're encouraging everybody to stand up against hate violence of all forms. We're running upstander trainings, really teaching people how to safely intervene when you witness an incident of hate violence in our streets, in our communities, in your school, at your workplace. And then the last thing I will say is we just launched a new project called LGBTQ Safe Spaces Protection Project, really recognizing that this is a different kind of moment in which we need to do something different to defend and protect all of our queer safe spaces around the country. We just launched a needs assessment, the first ever, where we're going to be creating some data around what's happening with all of these safe spaces across the country. What do they need to build safety? And then we're going to be building a policy and organizing effort to help ensure that our spaces get what we need. So folks can go to our website to get involved in that. There's still time if there are people representing safe spaces that they want to take the survey. So lots and lots of ways to get involved.
Lots of wonderful information, Beverly. Thank you so much. And thanks each of our panelists, Robert, Paul, and Terry, for your presentations. As any good panel as this one is, there's so much important information, and we could go on for a while, but in lieu of time, we're going to move on, sort of open it up to our viewing audience. And also just a reminder that this panel discussion, if you're here tonight, it'll be edited and available in the next few weeks, and we'll send you that information. If you're registered, we'll send that link to you. And so now I'll pass it to Annie, who will sort of start to work with the questions that have come in. And if they haven't come in, she'll sort of tell you how to do it now. Annie, you can take it away.
Thank you, Ed. So our first question is for Terry. The Zappalorti Mandala reminds me of the stained glass representing the Zappalorti family business. Was that your intention? I'm sorry, Terry, you're muted.
You're muted, Terry.
Okay. Yes, that was my intention, to create a stained glass. From a distance, it's much more stained glass, obvious.
Our second question is for Beverly. Can you speak more about upstander trainings?
Yeah, one of the things that happens, folks might remember, right, at the beginning of the Trump administration, where we were seeing a lot of increased hate, particularly targeting Muslim community and immigrants, and folks started wearing safety pins. And that was sort of in, an act of solidarity. And then people started thinking, well, so how could we be more proactive, right? How do we do more than just wear a pin or a button? And there's always been this idea of being an upstander, not just a bystander, right? How do you, when you see something happening that is not right, what can you do as a community member? And but it's scary, right? It's scary to imagine you see an interaction on the street or in the subway, and it's hard to know how you can intervene. What's the best thing in that situation? Being mindful of who you are and all the identities that you bring to the table, what's okay, what's not okay. So we actually take people through a training where we give them the tools to analyze a particular situation and then determine what's the best way for them in that moment, because it's going to be different for each of us, to stand in and show support. And some of the things are very simple, but they might not be intuitive. For instance, sometimes one of the things that's most helpful to do is to divert attention away from the person causing the harm and really give support to the person being harmed, right? And so there's lots of really, I think, very useful tools that people could put into practice right away after they finish the training, and really empowering folks to think about themselves as advocates for safety, and that, it's going to take all of us to address this issue of hate violence together. And until we all start feeling a little bit comfortable standing up for each other, we won't have that shift in culture that we need to. So we run these trainings periodically. We can do them virtually. We can come to your group and do them for you if you have an organization or a group that wants a bystander training, or individuals can sign up for a training that we're already running. So folks can check out our website. We have a list of events on our website, or they can reach out to us if they're interested in learning more specifically.
Thank you, Beverly. So we are open for more questions at this time. We are also, if you'd like to contribute, you can also raise your hand.
And if the panelists have any questions for one another, we're open for that as well.
I have a question for Robert. Robert, I'm curious, just, you know, like you said, it was a different time in Staten Island when Jimmy was killed. And, you know, we've mentioned already how supportive the family was. What did it take for you all to get to that place? Were you always at that place? Were there, you know, was it an evolution in your family? Just tell us, I would love to hear a little bit more about that.
Well, it wasn't an evolution for my brother and my sister and I, because, meaning my older brother, Michael, Jimmy was the youngest, and we all, you know, sort of watched over him and loved him very much. And we knew when he came out of the Navy that he was gay, but we also suspected it by some of his behavior, but he never admitted it until after he was out of the Navy. That's when he truly came out. But it didn't make any difference to us whether he was gay or straight. That's the bottom line. And my mother was just like us, but it was my father that took a little bit of time to accept Jimmy as a gay man, because he was half Spanish, half Italian, macho type man, and you know, he was old school. But eventually he came around as well. So I think my father was more brokenhearted than anybody when Jimmy was murdered, because Jimmy was his pet, you know, and he always tried to teach him things, and he wanted him to be in the stained glass business. And it's a lot of hard work making a stained glass. I don't know if you know the whole process, but it's not an easy task. And Jimmy loved working with the glass, and he made his own little stained glass windows and enjoyed it very much. So it was just very hard when we lost him. And I think it helped me to write about his story. It was my way of dealing with it, even though it took me a long time to write the book. So I did it in my spare time and had to do a lot of the research on my own. I actually learned from Paul Moakley. He's pretty good at doing research. I think he taught me a few things about, I could have done things a lot easier, but I wasn't computer savvy when I was younger. So you have a great advantage of knowing how to navigate the Google searching image and all that stuff. But it was just very lethargic and helpful for me to write the story and then finally see it in print. I don't know if I answered your question fully or not, but
yeah, completely, and more.
Okay, so we do have another question. I believe this one is for Paul. So who were the advocacy groups in Staten Island who were most active in working towards the hate crime laws?
Well, on Staten Island, there was the Lambda group here that was very active in organizing, and I would say is even like sort of the precursor to having the Pride Center on Staten Island. And they, you know, they coordinated with the family along with the AVP. And I think, it was interesting, like people from all different groups at this time really, were interested in this sort of moment and use the opportunity to raise awareness around violence. And so, it's never really like one person, it's a lot of people coming together, really trying to support this effort at the time. And I think that's like, something that I hope comes across the multitude of people it needs to take, that you need to really like affect change. And it sometimes happens slowly. And with a lot of people, but on Staten Island, it was Lambda. And they, their archive, one thing I'd love to mention is that is preserved at the Staten Island Museum. And there's actually a letter that Jimmy Zappalorti wrote to the museum requesting information on Lambda. And Robert seems to think their mother might have made Jimmy write the letter. We're not totally sure it was typed, but it is a great artifact that's in the museum that the museum actually, Janice Monger pulled out for me. And I'm glad that so much of that great history is preserved at the museum. So it's really exciting. And it's a great research tool for people like myself making things and for artists.
Thank you, Paul.
You're welcome. And I would just say the Pride Center on Staten Island does have a library. It's an incredible organization. There's so many layers to the amount of support they provide. And I would say if you're a family member or, you need support yourself, in terms of health, your physical health, your mental health, all sorts of, aid that they really help people find access to. And I would also check out the Staten Island Pride Center. It's really wonderful.
Any other questions? Well, I guess we'll end it there. Thanks to everyone. Thanks to our panelists, to the Staten Island Museum team, to family and friends, and tonight's attendees. Very important, if you or someone you know is or has experienced violence, including hate violence, intimate partner violence, sexual violence, and hookup violence, regardless of how you experience violence, it's unacceptable and you deserve support. So please contact AVP at 212-714-1141 24/7. It's their hotline, or you can email or go to avp.org/contact us. And that will also be in the, I'm putting that into the chat right now. So at this time, I would like to take a minute and initiate a minute of silence to honor our dear Jimmy Zappalorti's life, as well as our other brothers and LGBTQIA brothers and sisters who have had their lives brutally taken away way too soon because of misguided hate and violence. So we'll begin now. Again, thank you for joining us. May we as a global collective foresee in the near future the ability to find a path to safety, unity, understanding, dignity, compassion, and unconditional love. And until we reach that obtainable goal, please stay safe and protected. Have a good night, and thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you for doing this for Jimmy. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.